Some crimes fade with time, but others only grow colder, darker, and more unsettling. In every corner of the world, there are cases that have resisted every answer, murders without murderers, victims without names, and stories that end in silence. And for decades, investigators have chased shadows, piecing together timelines that don't add up, evidence that vanishes without explanation, and witnesses whose words only deepen the mystery. From blood-soaked alleyways of Evelyn Hart was last seen on the evening of September 14, 1978, standing under a flickering streetlight outside the entrance to the Willow Creek Cinema. She was 22, a college student with a sharp mind and a disarming smile, and she had told friends she was meeting someone, though she never said who. Witnesses recalled that she seemed distracted that day, glancing over her shoulder as if expecting to see someone following her. The theater marquee glowed with the title of the week's feature, The Last Train to Lisbon, and Evelyn stood just beyond its reach, her face half lit, half hidden in shadow. She never walked inside. Next morning, her roommate reported her missing when she failed to return home. Police initially assumed she had run off, perhaps a lover's escape, perhaps an impulsive decision, but her neatly made bed and untouched suitcase suggested otherwise. Her purse was found 3 days later in a storm drain 2 blocks from the cinema, contents soaked and scattered. A lipstick tube, a crumpled bus ticket, and a half-torn photograph of Evelyn standing beside an unidentified man, his face cut neatly out of the image, were recovered. The torn edges were smooth, deliberate, and investigators interviewed friends, family, and co-workers, but no one knew of any man in Evelyn's life who matched the partial figure in the photograph. Her mother insisted Evelyn had been preoccupied with something in the weeks before her disappearance, but could not say what. She had been seen frequenting the public library's microfilm archives, searching through old newspapers. When questioned, library staff vaguely remembered her spending hours hunched over the machine, flipping through crime reports from the 1940s and 1950s. She never explained her research to anyone. NTHE's most unsettling lead came from a man named Arthur Bell, a custodian who worked at the cinema. He told police he had seen Evelyn speaking to a tall man in a dark coat just outside the alley behind the theater shortly before the first showing ended. Arthur described the man as too still, his posture unnaturally rigid, as though he were waiting for something to happen. Evelyn appeared nervous, stepping back as he leaned forward. Then, without a word, she followed him into the darkness of the alley. Arthur, assuming it was a private matter, returned to sweeping the lobby. He never saw her again. Police searched the alley and the surrounding streets. They found no traces of Evelyn, but they did discover something strange. A set of shoe prints leading away from the alley and stopping abruptly at the middle of Sycamore Street. No turn, no break, just gone, as if the person had vanished mid-step. They photographed the prints, but they matched neither Evelyn's nor any known suspect's footwear. NTWO months into the investigation, Evelyn's roommate received a letter with no return address. Inside was a single sentence written in uneven, blocky letters. She found what she was looking for. There was no signature. The postmark indicated it had been mailed from a town over 200 miles away, a place Evelyn had no known connection to. The handwriting did not match anyone questioned in the case. Police suspected a hoax, but the roommate insisted it was genuine, that it carried a tone Evelyn herself might have recognized. In 1985, 7 years after Evelyn's disappearance, a set of human remains was discovered during construction on the old rail line outside Willow Creek. The bones belonged to a woman in her early 20s. Forensic testing was limited at the time, but dental records suggested a match to Evelyn Hart. Yet, there was something disturbing about the discovery. The body was found with an antique theater ticket from 1947, clenched in one hand, perfectly preserved despite the years underground. No one could explain how it had been placed there, nor why Evelyn, who had been researching old crimes, would have had it at the time of her death. NTHE case remains unsolved. Police files show that detectives quietly suspected Evelyn had stumbled upon evidence of an old, long-forgotten murder, perhaps one connected to the cinema's past. The last train to Lisbon Marquee was taken down decades ago. The theater closed, and the building now sits abandoned with its doors chained shut. Residents of Willow Creek still claim to see a young woman standing under the broken streetlight out front, half lit, half hidden in shadow, glancing over her shoulder as if she's still waiting for someone. On the outskirts of Fairwater County lies Red Hill, a stretch of barren, windswept earth where the grass refuses to grow and the soil stains your boots a deep rust color. Locals claim the hill was once the site of a failed mining settlement in the 1880s, abandoned after a series of strange accidents claimed the lives of nearly every worker. The county records list it as uninhabitable land and warn of unstable ground, but that hasn't stopped curious hikers from wandering its ridges, some of whom never return. NTHE modern string of disappearances began in 1993 with 14-year-old Jacob Morton. He told his friends he was going to ride his bike to the crest of Red Hill to see if the stories were true. His bike was found the next morning lying on its side at the base of the hill, chain still spinning. Jacob's footprints led halfway up the slope before abruptly turning in a tight circle as though he had been pacing, and then vanishing entirely. No signs of a struggle, no drag marks, nothing. Search dogs refused to approach the hilltop, whining and pulling back on their leashes. NTWO years later, in 1995, 28-year-old surveyor Denise Walsh disappeared while mapping the boundaries of Red Hill for a proposed wind farm. Her equipment was discovered neatly packed into her open Jeep at the base of the hill, the ignition still on. Inside her notebook, investigators found a final page with a hastily scrawled note. "The ground is breathing." NBY 2001, there were at least 7 missing persons tied to the area, all with eerily similar circumstances. Abandoned possessions, unfinished notes, and no trace of a struggle. The disappearances were always silent, always clean, as if the hill simply took them. Some theorized sinkholes, others suggested an unmarked mine shaft that swallowed victims whole, but geologists found no evidence of such hazards. In fact, Red Hill's soil composition was found to be unusually compact and dense, too dense for sinkholes to form naturally. NTHE's strangest case came in 2004, when amateur historian Lyle Groves vanished there. Lyle had been researching the mining company that once operated on the site, and according to his wife, he had recently become obsessed with a set of ledgers he found in the county archives. The ledgers recorded the names of miners who had worked the hill in 1883, but every 10th name was crossed out in thick red ink. Lyle reportedly told his wife it's not the ink, it's the dirt. Before leaving for Red Hill one early morning, he never came back. When police searched his home afterward, they found the ledgers laid open on his desk. In the margin beside the crossed-out names, Lyle had written the dates of each modern disappearance, as though drawing a direct link. The last entry, dated the day he vanished, was his own name, underlined twice. In 2011, a group of paranormal investigators camped at the base of the hill with thermal imaging cameras and audio recorders. On the third night, one of the cameras caught a faint ripple moving across the hill's surface, like heat distortion. Moments later, one of the team members shouted, "Something's coming up!" The footage ended abruptly. The rest of the group later claimed their colleague had been standing only 6 feet away, but in the blink of an eye, she was gone. Her footprints ended in the same tight, circular pattern as the others. Today, Red Hill remains fenced off, with faded warning signs bolted to the wire. Unsafe terrain. Do not enter. Still, trespassers report unsettling sensations. The feeling of the ground pulsing beneath their feet, the sound of muffled voices beneath the soil, and, on rare occasions, the sight of figures standing motionless on the crest, watching, before slowly sinking into the earth. No bodies have ever been recovered. The sheriff's department keeps a locked file labeled RH Unsolved, containing photos of all known victims. Each image has a faint reddish smudge on the bottom edge, as though the color bled in from somewhere it shouldn't exist. At the far end of Weller Street, in a quiet residential neighborhood that looks like it hasn't changed since the 1950s, sits a narrow 2-story house with peeling green paint and windows clouded over from the inside. It's been empty for as long as anyone can remember, though the county still lists a Margaret Vess as the legal owner, a woman no one in town has ever met. The house is an unassuming presence in the daylight, but at night, neighbors swear they see faint lamplight flicker in the upstairs windows, followed by the slow, deliberate movement of a shadow that doesn't match the shape of a person. NTHE's first recorded incident came in 1972 when 2 teenagers broke in on a dare. They were found the next morning sitting side by side on the curb in front of the house, silent and staring straight ahead. When questioned, they wouldn't speak, only writing the same sentence over and over on police notepads. There are too many rooms. Inside, police discovered something strange. The floor plan did not match the blueprints filed with the county. Rooms seemed to shift in size and location, hallways curved back into themselves, and doors sometimes opened to reveal brick walls. Over the decades, the few who dared enter reported similar disorientation. In 1989, A real estate agent named Frank Holloway tried to appraise the property, claiming he could handle a weird old house. He entered with a clipboard and measuring tape, and according to a neighbor who was watching from across the street, Frank appeared in the second-floor window almost immediately. But then another Frank appeared in the same window seconds later, slightly out of sync with the first. Neither one waved or called out. By nightfall, the police were called, but the house was empty. Frank's car was still in the driveway. His clipboard was found resting on the kitchen counter, the final note reading simply, "Not enough exits." In 2006, a structural engineer brought in for an urban legend documentary entered the house with a cameraman. The footage, later confiscated by authorities, reportedly shows the pair exploring what seemed like a standard kitchen before a doorway appeared, where there had been a blank wall moments earlier. When the cameraman stepped through, the footage distorted and the sound dropped out for 8 full minutes. The camera was later found on the front porch, lens cracked, with the engineer's voice faintly audible on the recording. "Don't follow the stairs up. They don't go up." The cameraman was never located. What unsettles investigators most is that the house seems to edit itself. A police team once tried marking the walls with spray paint to map their path, only to find the marks erased minutes later. One officer insisted they were being moved, not the paint, as if they had been relocated to another version of the same house. No team has ever been able to create a consistent map of the interior. Neighbors avoid walking past it at night, claiming that if you glance at the upstairs window too long, you'll catch a glimpse of your own reflection. Not as you are now, but older, worn down, with a look in your eyes like you've been wandering for years. One man swears he saw himself standing inside, motioning for him to come in. NTHE Weller Street house remains boarded up, though the boards are often found shifted, as if pushed from the inside. And on still nights, if you stand at the front gate, you might hear faint knocking from somewhere deep within, not at the door, but from beneath the floors, patient and steady, like someone counting the seconds until you decide to step inside. Nen. On a clear summer evening in 1994, 16-year-old Annalise Carr was last seen walking along the dirt shoulder of County Road 317, about 2 miles from her family's farmhouse in rural Minnesota. She had been at a friend's birthday gathering earlier that afternoon, and according to multiple guests, she left just before sunset, saying she needed to get home before dark because, quote, "the road changes after the light goes." The phrase struck her friends as odd. Annalisa wasn't prone to strange remarks, but she smiled and said she'd explain later. She never arrived home. NTHE search began immediately. Within hours, dozens of volunteers, dogs, and deputies combed the surrounding farmland and nearby woods. Oddly, several searchers claimed that the stretch of road where Annalisa was last seen seemed slightly, quote, quote, quote. Trees on the south side of the road appeared denser than usual, and one man swore the fence posts lining the fields were set farther apart than they had been earlier in the week. A few even reported feeling lightheaded and momentarily disoriented, as if the road beneath them was subtly tilting or stretching. 3 days later, deputies found Annalise's backpack at the base of a telephone pole, but not the same one where she had last been seen. Strangely, the backpack was bone dry despite 2 nights of heavy rain, and inside was a notebook containing only one new entry written in her neat handwriting. "It's longer now. Much longer than it should be. I think it wants me to keep walking." Over the following weeks, sightings trickled in from neighboring towns, but none could be confirmed. Then, in September, a local truck driver named David Ohl claimed he'd seen Annalise in his headlights while driving that same stretch of County Road 317 late at night. He swore she was walking away from him, but when he slowed to call out, she turned her head, and it was his own face staring back at him. Startled, he slammed the brakes, but when he looked again, the road ahead was empty. A year later, during routine maintenance on the road, county workers found something buried in the gravel shoulder, a shoe matching the one Annalisa had been wearing the day she vanished. But the shoe was pristine, unworn, and inexplicably warm to the touch, despite having been underground. Alongside it was a folded slip of paper with a single message, "Not yet." Locals began avoiding County Road 317 at night, claiming headlights sometimes revealed an extra bend in the road that didn't exist in daylight. A farmer even reported seeing the road fork into 2 identical paths under the moonlight, both stretching into darkness. By morning, there was only one road again. NTO this day. The official record lists Annalise Carr as a missing person. Her case file contains photographs of the road taken by investigators at different times of day, and in at least 2 images, the perspective seems impossible. Telephone poles subtly slanting toward a vanishing point that doesn't align with the horizon, as if the road leads somewhere far beyond the boundaries of the map. And though no one says it out loud, those who've lived here long enough quietly agree. If you walk far enough on County Road 317 after sundown, you might not be walking in Minnesota anymore. In November of 1978, 42-year-old Harold Vance walked into the Millbrook Police Department in upstate New York, claiming he had information about a string of unsolved break-ins that had plagued the area for months. Officers described him as calm but insistent, saying he needed to speak directly to the one in charge of the locks. There was no such position in the department, but Harold refused to elaborate until he could meet this person. Detective Frank Morrissey, who had been leading the burglary investigation, decided to speak with Harold in interview room 2, a small, windowless space with cinder block walls, a bolted table, and a single security camera mounted in the corner. Morrissey left the room briefly to retrieve a file, leaving Harold alone. The camera continued rolling, NFOR the first 7 minutes. Harold sat still, staring at the door. Then, without warning, he turned to face the opposite wall and began speaking in a low voice. The audio was faint, but technicians later enhanced it enough to catch fragments. "They're already inside. Hinges the wrong way. Don't let it close twice." He paused, then nodded, as if listening to someone respond, but no one else was in the room. At 7:42 p.m., Harold leaned forward, placed his hands flat on the table, and appeared to be breathing rapidly. His lips moved, forming words that matched none of the audio, as though he were speaking in silence. Then came the moment that froze everyone who later watched the tape. The camera's image shimmered, like heat rising off pavement, and Harold's outline seemed to blur. Within 5 seconds he was gone. The chair was still rocking from where he'd been sitting. Morrissey returned seconds later, baffled by the empty room. Believing Harold had slipped past him, he searched the hallways, then the entire building. No doors had opened, no alarms had tripped, and the front desk officer swore no one had exited. The security tape was sent to the state lab for analysis. They reported no edits, no glitches, except for a single frame that appeared different when magnified. In it, the wall behind Harold showed what looked like a faint outline of a door, but one set into the concrete itself, without hinges or a handle. The lab could not replicate the image in other frames, and when investigators returned to inspect the room, there was nothing unusual about the wall. Months later, an officer working the night shift claimed he heard faint knocking from inside interview room 2 while walking past. When he opened the door, the room was empty, but the knocking continued for several seconds from the wall where Harold had been staring. NBY 1980, the tape had vanished from evidence storage. The official explanation was misplaced during transfer, but the officer responsible for the archive later told a friend, "It's better no one sees it again." He wasn't talking to us. He was talking to whoever was waiting on the other side. NTHE Millbrook Police Department quietly renovated the interview rooms in 1981, replacing the cinder block with drywall. Still, rumors persist that, late at night, certain corners of the building smell faintly of Harold's aftershave, and if you knock twice on the old load-bearing wall where room 2 once stood, something knocks back. In January of 1964, 3 college friends, Daniel Cross, Lydia Martin, and Peter Holloway, vanished during a winter camping trip near the forests of Franklin County, Maine. Their last known location was a remote hunting cabin that Daniel's uncle had inherited but rarely used. The structure was built in the late 1800s and, according to locals, had been abandoned for decades before Daniel suggested they spend a weekend there for the isolation. When the friends didn't return to campus, a search party set out. Heavy snowfall had buried the road to the cabin, so rescuers had to hike the last mile on foot. What they found confounded even the most experienced searchers. The cabin stood perfectly intact, except there were no visible doors. Where a door frame should have been was a solid wall of weathered wood, seamless, as though it had never been cut. Windows were present, but grimy and impossible to see through. Rescuers broke one and climbed inside. The cabin was tidy, with 3 sleeping bags neatly rolled against the wall, boots arranged in a row, and a kettle still warm on the stove. There was no sign of struggle, no dropped belongings, and no way the 3 could have left without tearing through the walls or windows. NTHE strangest detail was the snow outside. It was completely untouched, except for the party's own footprints. There were no signs of animals, no human tracks, and no marks of any kind leading away. Inside, a journal belonging to Lydia was found on the table. The last entry, dated 2 days earlier, read, quote, "The knocking hasn't stopped. It started in the floorboards, but now it's in the walls, higher each time. Peter thinks it's the wind, but Daniel says the boards are answering him. Last night I dreamed there was a fourth sleeping bag, and something breathing inside it. This morning, the bag was there, folded neatly with ours. We didn't bring it. Search teams combed the forest for weeks, but no trace of the three was ever found. The cabin was dismantled in the spring, and workers reported that when they removed the outer wall where the door should have been, they found another wall directly behind it. No interior space, just layered boards as though the doorway had been sealed from the moment the cabin was built. Decades later, a hiker camping in the area claimed to hear rhythmic knocking from somewhere in the woods at night, matching the pattern of a door being knocked on 3 times, paused, then twice more. When he returned the following year, he found a small hunting cabin standing exactly where the old one had been, despite there being no construction permits or signs of work. The cabin had no door. In October 1928, the merchant vessel Aurelia was found adrift in the North Atlantic, roughly 200 miles southeast of Newfoundland. She was spotted by the fishing trawler Eleanor May, whose crew reported that the Aurelia was moving aimlessly in calm seas, her sails partially unfurled despite having a working engine. When they boarded, they found no one on deck, but the ship was far from deserted. And in the mess hall, a long table had been set for 12. Plates of fish stew sat steaming, bread still warm, mugs filled with beer halfway to the brim. There was no sign of decay, mold, or coldness in the food, as though it had been prepared only minutes earlier. Yet the ship's log recorded the last entry 3 days prior. That final note read simply, "N. The horizon has gone wrong. Sea moving without wind. Hear them in the galley. 12 voices. We are 11. All personal belongings remained neatly stored in the crew's quarters. Clothing folded, boots lined at the foot of bunks. There were no signs of struggle or violence. The lifeboats hung in place, untouched. The only peculiarity in the captain's cabin was a hand-drawn chart pinned to the wall, showing a section of the ocean that didn't match any known coordinates, marked with a symbol resembling an open mouth. NTHE crew of the Eleanor May attempted to tow the Aurelia back to port, but during the night a dense, low fog rolled in. Visibility dropped to mere feet. By morning, the merchant vessel was gone, the tow line cut clean as though severed by something impossibly sharp. The Aurelia was never seen again. In the years following, sailors in the North Atlantic told of hearing strange noises through the fog, the clinking of cutlery, muffled voices speaking in an unknown tongue, and the smell of fresh fish stew wafting over empty waters. In 1972, a Canadian Coast Guard patrol recorded a distress call containing nothing but the sound of 12 spoons striking 12 bowls in slow unison. The call lasted exactly 1 minute and 11 seconds before ending abruptly. NTO this day, maritime records list the fate of the Aurelia as crew missing, presumed lost at sea, though unofficially, Some whisper it wasn't the crew that went missing at all. It was the 12th voice finally finding a table to sit at. In 1954, New York police arrested a drifter named Leonard Pike for breaking into a pawn shop on East 12th Street. The crime itself was unremarkable: a smashed display case, a few stolen watches, nothing more. What caught the department's attention was what happened during booking. As protocol dictated, Pike's fingerprints were taken and run through the national database. The result was immediate and baffling. One hand matched a petty thief from Chicago named Arthur Bell. The other hand matched a deceased Navy sailor from 1943 named Harold Finch, and his left thumb matched a third man, a missing person from 1929 named Joseph Kramer, whose disappearance had been linked to an unsolved triple homicide in Ohio. Thinking it was a clerical error, the police retook the prints. The same result. This time, the database flagged all three identities as belonging to different individuals with no familial relation. Pike, unfazed, simply smiled during questioning and claimed, "We all take turns." When asked to explain, he would only repeat, "I'm not the one you should be talking to." And a deeper investigation revealed further anomalies. Dental records didn't match any of the three men. In fact, Pike's teeth showed three distinct patterns of dental work, as though they had been replaced in sections by different dentists decades apart. X-rays revealed that several bones in his hands and arms had faint but discernible surgical seams, signs of bone grafts. Yet none of the medical techniques matched the era in which Pike claimed to have lived. When confronted, Pike became agitated, demanding to be sent back before the others wake up. That night, guards reported hearing three distinct voices coming from his cell, each speaking in a different accent: Midwestern American, New England Coastal, and clipped military British. Surveillance footage from the time, grainy and degraded, appeared to show Pike's posture and facial expressions shifting subtly as the voices changed. NTWO days later, he vanished. The cell was locked, the bars untouched, and no sign of forced entry was found. The only thing left behind was a single fingerprint smeared across the wall, but when analyzed, it matched none of the three original men. It was a fourth print belonging to a woman named Eliza Gant, who had died in 1892. NTHE file remains open in NYPD archives, marked with a note written in red ink: "Do not close." Possible contamination of identity beyond recorded limits. In the winter of 1976, the small coastal town of Whitson, Maine, found itself the subject of quiet gossip after a peculiar incident at the municipal library. On the morning of January 14th, head librarian Margaret Toomey arrived to find three books neatly stacked on the front desk. All bore the library's embossed stamp, but the lending records showed they hadn't been checked out in decades, and in one case, not since 1904. What unsettled Margaret most was their condition. The pages were crisp, the ink unfaded, as though they had been printed yesterday. And at first, she assumed a local collector had returned them anonymously. But when she tried to scan the books into the library's catalog system, each attempt failed. The barcodes, some affixed in the 1990s, long after the book's last recorded checkout, simply weren't there anymore. The glue marks on the covers suggested the codes had never existed. And over the next month, more books began to appear, always in the morning, always in pristine condition, and always with no record of who had borrowed them. Among them were rare first editions that had been missing for over a century, including a copy of a general history of the pirates last seen in the personal collection of a shipwreck victim in 1912. Things turned stranger still when Margaret opened one of the returned books, a 19th century volume of poetry, and found a fresh inscription in the margin, written in her late father's handwriting. "You missed this one." The man had died when she was 9. The library's security cameras, installed in February, caught something even more puzzling. At 3:12 a.m. one night, the feed flickered, and for a single frame, a long row of empty shelves appeared filled to bursting with books, many of which had never existed in the library's known collection. The next morning, 3 more returns were waiting at the desk. Margaret began keeping the books at her home, convinced there was a pattern. She claimed the titles, when read in order, began to form sentences, disjointed but eerily coherent. The last sequence she recorded read, "We only borrow what you forget to remember. NBY March." The phenomenon stopped. No new books appeared. The ones Margaret had kept lost their unusual luster, pages yellowing and binding, loosening as though they'd simply aged overnight. The library's board dismissed it as a hoax. But in the archives, the incident is still filed under Unresolved, with a single note in the margin. "Check again in 30 years. Due date unknown." In the spring of 1984, at St. Augustine's Psychiatric Hospital in rural Pennsylvania, a new patient was admitted under the name John Doe, though his fingerprints and facial recognition scans returned no matches. He had been found wandering barefoot along Route 53, his hands covered in what police at first assumed was dried blood, but later identified as a reddish, iron-rich clay. When asked his name, he responded in a fluid, melodic language no one recognized. And over the next weeks, hospital staff recorded hours of his speech. Linguists from the University of Pennsylvania were called in and were stunned to discover he was alternating between at least 5 different languages, all extinct, some not spoken for over 2,000 years. Among them was ancient Sumerian, an obscure dialect of Old Egyptian, and a variant of Linear A, which remains undeciphered to this day. NHE appeared otherwise healthy, though he reacted violently to mirrors, smashing one in his room on his 3rd day there, and shouting what a visiting Assyriologist translated as, "That is not me. That is the one who waits." Nurses noticed an odd pattern. Every night, precisely at 2:17 a.m., he would wake and sit upright, staring at the far corner of his room, speaking in a whisper that grew louder until it became a chant. A recording of one of these episodes revealed fragments of words that, when compared to ancient inscriptions, seemed to form invocations, though to what or whom no one could say. On July 9, 1984, he was found missing from his locked room. The window was intact, the door still bolted from the inside. In his place was a small pile of the same iron-rich clay found on him the night of his admission. Lab analysis revealed the clay matched a mineral deposit found only in a specific archaeological site in southern Iraq, a site that, at the time, had been abandoned for over 4,000 years. Hospital staff were questioned exhaustively, but no one had seen him leave. The official file lists him as a missing person, but in the margin of the attending psychiatrist's final note is a single sentence, scrawled in shaky handwriting. He spoke of returning to finish the conversation. In the quiet town of Fairvale, Oregon, there stood a Victorian house on the corner of Whitlock Street, the kind of place that looked like it had been pulled out of a sepia photograph and left untouched for 100 years. It had been vacant for decades, its windows shuttered, its paint peeling into long, curling strips. In 1991, a young couple, Thomas and Irene Keats, bought it at auction, thrilled to own such a historic property for a fraction of its value. The neighbors warned them, in that half-joking way people use when they mean it entirely, that no one stayed in the Whitlock house for more than a month. NTHE first week was uneventful. Then, Irene noticed the grandfather clock in the hallway ticking backwards. Thomas assumed it was a mechanical fault, but when they checked the other clocks in the house, an old mantel clock, a brass carriage clock in the study, even a battery-powered kitchen timer they had brought themselves, all of them ran in reverse. Replacing the batteries, rewinding the springs, even buying a brand-new clock from the hardware store made no difference. By the following morning, it too ticked backward. More unsettling was what happened when they tried to set their wristwatches or use their digital alarm clock. At first, the time would hold steady, but after a few minutes inside the house, the numbers would flicker and begin to descend, minute by minute, into the past. On the 12th day, Irene swore she saw someone in the upstairs hallway, not a shadow or reflection, but a figure in a long, dark dress with hair pinned in a severe bun. The woman's face was pale, her lips unmoving, but her eyes seemed to plead for something neither Thomas nor Irene could name. They began hearing noises, muffled voices speaking in a clipped, formal English, the rustle of skirts, the sound of doors opening in rooms they knew were locked. Most chilling of all were the nights when the couple awoke to find the air thick with the scent of wood smoke and kerosene, as if the house were preparing for some old ritual. NTWO, weeks after moving in, Thomas found a stack of brittle papers hidden in the attic, fragments of a diary dated 1894. The last entry read, "The clocks are wrong again. We must leave before they take us back. We cannot survive it twice." On the 23rd night, Thomas awoke to the sound of all the clocks in the house chiming together, but instead of a harmonious peal, each bell rang in strange, discordant tones. Irene was gone. Her side of the bed was still warm. He searched every room, calling her name, but found no trace of her, except for her wristwatch, lying on the kitchen counter, frozen at the exact minute the chimes began. Thomas left the house before sunrise. It remains vacant to this day. Neighbors say that on certain nights, if you stand outside and listen closely, you can hear the faint ticking of 100 clocks, all counting backward toward a moment no one dares to reach. In the autumn of 1938, the small coal mining town of Harrow's End, Pennsylvania, was shaken by the sudden death of a 16-year-old girl named Evelyn Miles. She was well-liked, the kind of bright, smiling face that seemed immune to the grayness of the town's soot-stained streets. When she fell ill with what the town doctor called a fever of the blood, the decline was swift. Within 3 days, she was gone. Her parents, devastated, held a simple funeral, and Evelyn was laid to rest in the Harrow's End Cemetery, in the Miles family plot beneath a thin maple tree whose leaves had turned the color of rust. NTWO nights later, the gravedigger, a reclusive man named Albert Green, stumbled into the sheriff's office, pale as moonlight, trembling so hard he could barely speak. What they could piece together from his broken words was this. He had gone to the cemetery at dusk to retrieve his shovel, left leaning against the fence when he heard scraping. Not the sound of animals digging, slower, heavier. When he turned toward the Miles plot, he saw a figure climbing out of Evelyn's grave. NTHE figure was barefoot, dressed in the white burial dress Evelyn had worn, streaked with damp soil. Her hair hung in clumps, her skin was colorless but unblemished. Most terrifying was her face, not twisted in pain, not slack in death, but calm, almost serene. She didn't look at him. She simply stood at the edge of her grave for a long moment, then began walking slowly toward the woods beyond the cemetery. Sheriff Warren and 2 deputies searched the woods for hours that night, finding nothing but broken branches and disturbed leaves along a narrow path that led deeper into the hills. They organized a wider search in the morning, but no trace of Evelyn was ever found. No footprints, no torn fabric, no body. NHER parents refused to believe Albert's story, but rumors spread quickly through Harrow's End. Some swore they saw Evelyn in the weeks that followed, glimpsed from the corner of the eye at the edge of the tree line, or standing motionless by the river, her pale feet submerged in the current. One miner claimed she appeared in his home late one night, dripping wet, and whispered something he couldn't understand before vanishing. NTHE cemetery caretaker years later admitted privately to the pastor that Evelyn's coffin had been found empty when they exhumed it for a maintenance inspection in the early 1950s. Inside was only a folded piece of cloth and a small, smooth stone, black as coal, etched with a spiral. No one knew what it meant. NTO this day, hikers sometimes report seeing a barefoot girl in a dirt-stained white dress wandering the hills near Harrow's End, her eyes distant, her mouth moving in silent prayer. And every autumn, when the maple leaves turn the color of rust, the Miles family grave seems to sink a little deeper into the earth, as though the ground itself is swallowing the memory of her return.